Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
They're helping us every day. They're reducing hospitalizations and mortality. And don't kid yourself, the chances of you being hospitalized or dying from COVID is much greater if you are not vaccinated. The data is very clear on that, and it has held up throughout this last 12 months.
Welcome back to Healthcare Matters, the podcast that pulls back the curtain to help you make sense of complex healthcare economics and policy issues. He's Dr. Robert Popovian, joining us from our nation's capital, a pharmacist, economist, and chief science policy officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
And as always, across the country from Seattle, Washington, he's Connor Mertens, one of our very finest patient advocates and community outreach managers at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
And listen, we're glad you're here for the start of season 2 of Healthcare Matters.
And we are really happy that you are joining us. And one thing that has helped us was your feedback. We want to hear from you. And it is important for us to hear from you because it helps us hone our podcast to meet your demands. So we want to start each episode with feedback from our listeners.
Right. And this week, our review comes from Mason B on Twitter, who writes, "Binging the new Healthcare Matters podcast on this otherwise painfully boring drive through South Georgia, but low-key it's super good and crazy informative. Everyone should go listen to it." Couldn't agree more, Mason. Thanks for your review. We invite you to go to Apple Podcasts and write a positive review and leave an honest 5-star rating. And wherever you're listening, Apple, Spotify, or the rest, click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode.
I love that feedback. Connor, let's get into this week's episode.
Robert, this week we're going to circle back to a topic we've already covered. We want to hear a little bit more about vaccines. Specifically, what is the difference between early use authorization and FDA approval in the U.S. market?
Early use authorization is a designation by the Food and Drug Administration that has been around for a long time. It is basically FDA's version of saying that this product is still under investigation, but we feel that it has enough data to support the early use by patients because the benefits supersede the risk of taking this drug and that there's an environment that we need this. We've seen a lot of discussion about early use authorization and FDA approval during this last couple of years because the initial vaccines that have been approved have actually were approved through the early use authorization designation rather than the full approval. Currently in the marketplace, the only vaccine for COVID-19 that has been fully approved is the Pfizer vaccine. And the Moderna and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine are still under early use authorization, but they're being evaluated by the FDA.
And we've seen how effective these vaccines have been at saving lives and preventing serious illness and disease progression with this virus. What are some of the other things that are utilization? What's this Novavax that I've heard about?
So Novavax is a pharmaceutical company that is developing what I consider to be the third vaccine in this marketplace with a different mechanism of action. It has yet to get either early use authorization or approval from the FDA, but I know that the FDA is reviewing its dossier and the data to see how they may judge based on what's currently available in the market.
What are the differences in the way that these vaccines work? Because I know the vaccines from growing up that have live cultures in them. Then there's the new technologies are relatively new that's been popularized or discussed more recently, which is the mRNA vaccines. What are we seeing with these Novavax and Pfizer and all these other vaccines?
So let's start with the first two that were approved, which is the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines for COVID infection. The mechanism of action, how they work, is really through the mRNA platform. Now, mRNA platform has been around for decades, and investigators and researchers have been looking into this platform to develop a variety of different therapeutics. The COVID-19 vaccines were really the first time that this platform was able to successfully bring a product into the marketplace. So what is the mechanism of action of the mRNA COVID vaccines? Well, the vaccine delivers a tiny piece of genetic code from the SARS-CoV-2 virus to the host cells in the body, essentially giving those cells instructions or blueprints for making copies of the spike proteins.
And this is just a code. This isn't the actual COVID virus.
That's right. And what happens that these spikes do the work of penetrating and infecting the host cells And these proteins stimulate an immune response, producing antibodies and developing memory cells that will recognize and respond if the body is infected with the actual virus. So in other words, it sends a genetic signal that creates the spike protein that then develops the antibodies for defeating the disease.
And how does that differ from some of these other vaccines that are in the marketplace now?
Good question. So the next one approved after Moderna and Pfizer was the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And that one is considered a carrier vaccine. What is a carrier vaccine? Is when scientists engineer a harmless adenovirus as a shell to carry genetic code to the spike protein on the cell. The shell and the code don't make you sick, but once the code is inside the cells produce a spike protein that creates antibodies and memory cells that protects us against the COVID-19 virus. The last one is really the Novavax one that has not yet been approved, as we discussed, or authorized for use, but that one is considered an adjuvant.
What's an adjuvant? Come on, that's a big word.
So protein adjuvant is really, it contains the spike protein of the coronavirus itself, but formulated as a nanoparticle, which cannot cause disease. This is much more similar to what you mentioned, Connor, earlier, which is the typical, the less potent virus given to the patient so they can create antibodies for themselves and then hence be protected against the disease. And when the vaccine is injected, this stimulates the immune system to produce antibodies and T-cell immune responses. So in other words, I think what you were referring to earlier on, of which of these vaccines is really similar to what you remember as a child receiving, is more the Novavax vaccine that's being developed currently.
Well, Robert, you can see how this gets confusing to some people because there's so many different mechanisms and technologies, and how do we know which one's the right one for me? There's a million questions we can ask. And the other piece to this is that we've seen the miles of red tape it takes for drugs and therapies to be approved. This one seemed to happen in record pace. How do we set people's mind at ease that things were done right and that these are vaccines that we can trust?
So first and foremost, you need to educate yourself and utilize the resources that are coming from sources that you do trust. So those sources happen to be, in my opinion, the Food and Drug Administration data and information from the Center for Disease Control. And the most importantly, and something that we adhere to at Global Healthy Living Foundation, anytime anyone has questions about their therapies, you should always first approach your healthcare professional that you are working with. It's either your physician, your pharmacist, your nurse practitioner, your nurse, and ask them. The reason being is that they know more about you than any other bureaucratic system in this country. And they can answer the question and tailor it to meet your needs as an individual patient. And this is something that Global Healthy Living Foundation lives by every day. We believe that tailored, customized therapies are important to patients, but so is information that is tailored and customized for the needs of that patient. And you work on this every single day. You deal with our patients that you come across. And I think that that's the best advice that we can give them. Look, people have a lot of questions. Without a doubt, these vaccines were approved in a record time, but there was also very unusual circumstances where this country was going through. And the world was going through. I shouldn't say just the United States, the entire global community was going through. And the other thing that we have to realize is that when we went through these mechanisms of action, like I mentioned with the mRNA, this platform has been investigated for decades. It wasn't something new that was thrown out for people to look at. People were investigating this platform for a variety of other disease areas, including infectious diseases. It just happened that they had to accelerate a lot of these therapies and these investigations. And in addition, you have to realize the regulatory body of this country, the Food and Drug Administration, was fully focused on defeating the COVID-19 virus. And when you have the complete attention of a bureaucratic body like an FDA, you are going to be able to move things along much quicker than possibly in normal circumstances.
Right. Not to mention the fact that so much of the world's money and resources and scientists and willpower was dedicated to finding this vaccine. I think that's a perfect explanation for why we were able to get these vaccines in record time and why they've been so effective.
Connor, it was all hands on deck, right? It was an unusual circumstance, something that none of us had experienced in our lifetime, possibly multiple lifetimes, and hope not to experience it again in any lifetimes preceding us. At the end of the day, you're absolutely right. It was all hands on deck. We needed to get this thing done. We had some tools in our toolbox that we reached out to, and we were very fortunate that those tools worked. And we were able to get ourselves into a place that actually we have therapies now, we have vaccines, and hopefully one of our next episodes will talk about actual treatments of COVID-19, not just vaccines that prevent COVID-19.
I'm excited to dive into the topic about therapies rather than the prevention aspect of it, because that's a very interesting conversation that's had a lot of mixed reviews over the last year or two and a lot of skepticism and questions. I think the most common thread that we can put throughout this pandemic has been questions and misinformation. So we're always happy to help provide some of that good information. Speaking of that good information, what should folks take away from this episode, Robert?
Number one, there's multiple ways that vaccines work. There's not one mechanism of action. 3 different vaccines that are available in the market in the US currently. They have 2 different mechanisms of action. A third one is being developed by Novavax that hopefully will come out into the market soon. Number 2, if you have questions, there's good data with the Food and Drug Administration and with the Center for Disease Control, but there's better data with your healthcare professional. They know you the best. And we at GHLF believe in that the sanctity of the patient, provider, patient, healthcare professional relationship. And they're going to be the ones that help you the most navigating this information. Obviously, as a patient organization, we're out there. We have individuals like Connor who are communicating with our patients every day that we can help out. But for you to have the best tailored answer for your needs, reach out to your healthcare professional that you work with. So that's the number 2. And the number 3 thing is that don't fret. Vaccines are out there. They're helping us every day. They're reducing hospitalizations and mortality. And don't kid yourself. The chances of you being hospitalized or dying from COVID is much greater if you are not vaccinated. The data is very clear on that. And it has held up throughout this last 12 months. The most important thing is that the vaccines are out there to help you, but there are other therapies. So tune in on our next episode to learn about treatments for COVID vaccine and not just about vaccines themselves.
And at the end of the day, I think a good lesson that I want to take away from this is talk to your doctors. Trust the vaccine, trust your doctor, trust your pharmacist, trust Dr. Robert Popovian. Don't trust your uncle on Facebook, and go get vaccinated so we can get out of this thing. We can get back to some semblance of normalcy soon.
We hope you guys learned something from this episode. We would love to hear from you. Send your email or audio clip to healthcarematters@ghlf.org. We want to hear from you. It is important for us to capture your feedback because that makes us better at delivering the information to you as patients, as consumers, as healthcare professionals.
And thanks for tuning in to Healthcare Matters, a podcast that pulls back the curtain to help you make sense of complex healthcare economics and policy issues. We invite you to go to Apple Podcasts and leave an honest 5-star rating and write a positive review. It'll help more people like you find us. And wherever you're listening, Apple or Spotify or wherever, click that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. He's Dr. Robert Popovian.
And he's Connor Mertens. Please join us for our next episode.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.